Okay, welcome back to part 3. In part 1 we had our intro, in part 2 we sliced up our PSD. In this part 3 we're going to begin coding our HTML, and then in part 4 we will convert that straight to WordPress. So I'm going to open up my PSD WordPress tutorial folder, and we have an images folder, but I want to add a little bit more. I know down the line we're going to be adding a bit of JavaScript, so I'm going to create a new folder, and this is preparing our website called JS, and that will hold our JavaScripts. Next, I know we need a CSS file, correct? So we need to add a style.css file. And then also we need our standard index.html, which will ultimately become PHP. So I'm going to open up my code editor of choice. It's going to be Coda. And I'm going to go to my local, and I'm going to browse to desktop and go to WordPress tutorial, and we are set to get started. So I'm going to create a new file, and this is going to be index.html. And then I'm also going to create a new file called style.css. But of course, we need to create a CSS folder to stay as organized as possible. CSS. Within this, I'm going to add a new file, and we're going to call this style.css. Now, this is the way you normally do it. However, you're going to find that when creating a WordPress template, you should keep your style.css file within the root of your theme. So I'm going to actually take this out and remove the folder. We can use the CSS for other files if we like, but for now, this will be just fine. Open up index.html, and we have a blank canvas. That's all we need to get started. So I'm going to begin by adding just a basic skin. We have our doc type. I'm using XHTML strict. Actually, this isn't necessary. This is just kind of what it's set to. You could get by with transitional or even 4.01. It really doesn't matter too much, but this is hardly necessary to use XHTML strict. If you need more information on that subject, just do a quick Google search because it's been talked about quite a bit lately. So we have a title. I'm going to call this JW because that's kind of the name of this site for me. And we have our meta tag, that's fine. Now we need to link to our style sheet. So let's do link rel equals style sheet, type equals text/CSS, and the href is going to be style.css. So now we are pointing to our style.css file. So let's go back to our Photoshop file and take a look around. We know that we're going to have a background, and then you see that this entire website is basically encapsulated in just this kind of a wrapping div. So let's use a wrapping div so that we can contain it all like so. Okay? Hide that. And within my body tag, we're going to begin. I'm going to type div id equals wrap. Now, I prefer to comment the end of my divs, especially with WordPress, because they'll be divided up among many files. So I find it's easy for me to comment those. You're free to do something else if you like. So if we come back to Photoshop, the next step is to get this section up here. Okay? So we have this this is all kind of the header section. We have some navigation, our logo, and the slogan. So let's do that right now. I'm going to create a new div with an ID of header. And within this header, let's add our logo, and that should be placed within an H1 tag. And it's also going to be a link. We would like it to link back to the home page. This is very common. And the name of it's just going to be JW. Save it. Now you might be thinking, well, what about the image? This is an image. Well, we can set a specific width and height to that H1 tag, and then we can apply this image as a background. So don't worry about that right now. The next step is we need to create our navigation. So we need home, about, and contact. So within our header, let's create an unordered list. And within it, let's create a list item. And I'm going to give each one an ID. So the reason I'm doing that is because if you take a look, each one of these items has a personal icon associated with it. So I need a way to latch on. And currently the best way to do that would be to add an ID. So ID equals home. And within it, let's do another anchor tag. We're going to link it nowhere for now. And we're going to call it home. Okay, copy that. That's going to be about. This is going to be contact. About contact. And we need to make sure we change the IDs accordingly. About. Okay, so let's come back. What's next? We have this search, and actually there should be, I'm sorry it's missing, I have a little RSS icon that goes right there. I must have accidentally deleted it. Don't worry, it's just your standard RSS image that's going to go right there. So I changed this a bit when I ultimately finished up the design and the layout for this tutorial. But initially, we're going to continue with what I had in mind. And I decided, maybe I'll just continue the list item and add this search form and then another list item for the RSS. So let's do that right now. Whoops, undo that. And this next list item, the ID, it still has an icon associated with it. So I'm going to call that search. And after the search, we need to append this image. Now, once again, I ultimately decided to use a background image for that search icon, but it's important to show you how I got to where we ultimately ended up. So the source of this is we want to grab to image and then search icon. So img/search icon.png. Let's give it an alt. We're going to say search for something. And I can get rid of, I'm running out of real estate. Let's close this down, like so. And I can get rid of this anchor tag. And give me just a moment. Okay, so we have our image. So now let's add an input. This is going to be that little search field. So input type equals text name. Let's think of a name. Let's do S for search. And I'm also going to give it an ID of S just in case I decide to use JavaScript maybe far down the line. And let's give it a value, and this is going to be the text that's currently within the text box. And we're going to say search. Okay, and close out the list item. So to clean this up a little bit, why don't we put the image on its own line and then the input. All right, and then finally, we are going to have the RSS that somehow is not showing up on Photoshop. We'll have to fix that later. And within it, it's going to be an anchor tag linking to our RSS feed once we turn it into a template. But within the anchor tag, let's add an image. And this is going to link to some RSS image that we save. Let's just imagine we save it as rss.png. We'll come back to that, though I'm sure I'll forget. And that should take care of our navigation. So if we click preview, that's what we end up with. Now this is showing up obviously because we haven't gotten that RSS icon. So what I'll do is probably between tutorials, I'll go find that RSS image and bring it in. Actually, you know what? Just so I don't forget, I'm going to do it right now. I'll be right back. Okay. And this is what I was referring to, just kind of a red RSS icon that I've now dragged in. So I can close that out. And if we come back to preview, I have to reload that. Reload. And now we have our image. So let's continue on. The next step is to add our slogan. So if you come back right here, we want to add another rarely updated blog. And if you remember, we used an image for that. So let's do the same. Right before the end of our header, let's do it with a P tag. So I'm going to give it a P. Now, I know that I don't necessarily need to add an ID because it's the only paragraph within the header, so I could access it later with CSS using header P. But what if later down the road I decide to add more paragraph tags? I'm going to play it safe and go ahead and give this an ID. And I'm going to give it an ID of slogan. And I'm going to write another rarely updated blog. Then we'll use CSS to add the actual image as a background image. All right. So we've ended our header. We're all set. And what's the next step? Let's come back to Photoshop. The next step is this main section right here. So we have our header, now we need this new main section that is composed of our primary area and our sidebar area. So let's come back and let's create a new wrapping div id equals main, end main. And within it, we are going to add two sections. A primary section that will house the main content, and then a secondary section that will have the sidebar and all of those little widgets. So I'm going to come back and let's add those in right now. Div id equals primary, and the next one is secondary. Now, ultimately, we're going to be changing this name to sidebar, but I wanted to keep it as simple and true to a normal conversion. So secondary and secondary. There we go. So within this area, we have these items. Now, you see there's similarities between each one. They all have this background. They're all pretty much the same thing other than the text. So let's give it a class. Let's go within primary. And I'm going to type div class equals post-item. Now I gave it a class because you cannot assign more than one element an ID and expect your page to validate. So when I know I want to affect a group of items on my page, I use class. End post-item. All right. And we begin by adding our image. So right here, we have these images. Now I need to pull those in. So once again, I'm going to pause. I'm going to grab 3 200 by 200 pixel arbitrary images and bring them in. I'll be right back. And I'm back. Now I've created a new folder called Post Images, and that's because it has nothing to do specifically with the theme, and we can ultimately remove it once that becomes dynamic. So I wanted to separate it, and we just have 3 images. Okay, and these are taken from some of my postings, some of other people's postings on net.tutsplus.com. Close that out. And let's come back. So let's add our image source. The alt, I'm just going to call it post image. Ultimately, we will change that to maybe the name of the posting. But the source is going to be img/post images, and the first one's going to be 1.jpg. All right, so we've taken care of our wrapping div, and now we have our image. Next, let's add our heading, and that sounds like a good idea for maybe an H2 tag. H2, and we're just going to hard code it in, my first posting. And then next, we have the date, so let's do p class equals, I'm going to give it a class of meta, and that will be so that I can style the information of when the post was made and maybe what the date was and things like that. So let's come back and close that out, and we'll say 4109 in inspiration. Maybe that's a category I created called inspiration with WordPress. And then finally, we just need to paste in some generic text. So let's just go zoom out. I'm going to copy that and bring it back and paste it in. All right, let me clean this up since I just have such little real estate on this small screen. There we go. So come back, zoom out. We have our image, our heading, our information, our posting. I do need to get this little comment bubble, but we might just save that for later since we know it won't be in our HTML template. So let's come back. And this is what we have. So I'm going to give a little bit of spacing. And you see here, here's our post item. So I'm just going to grab that, copy it, because I know it's essentially the same thing. And I'm going to do 2 more, like so. The only thing that's different, at least for this static, pretty much a sample, is the image. If you wanted to keep a site template and not make it dynamic, you could manually update each of these, but I would not recommend that. So let's go and back into Photoshop. So we now have 3. that looks pretty good for the main section. Why don't we begin working on our sidebar? Now this will change quite a bit when we move it to WordPress, but let's still do it manually. We need a, looks like each of these have their own little box, so maybe we can create a little widget div. So within secondary, I'm going to begin by creating a div with a class of, I'm going to change this later, but for now, I'm going to call it secondary box, something like that. All right, and we'll use h3 tags for the headings right here. That way we can apply the red background. But if you remember, I ultimately changed that to kind of a darker gray. h3, and we're going to call it recent entries. This is just kind of sample info for now, though. And let's see. Yeah, I'm sorry, I actually got screwed up. Recent entries will be at the bottom. So let's go ahead and finish that up, and then we'll work our way up. List item. Some post entry will go here. And let's grab a few. One moment. Whoa! Weird. Okay. So, I have no idea why this will not come up. There we go. Strange. So we have our images. Let's work our way up now. Div class equals secondary box. That way the formatting stays the same. And we are going to have this recent entries. So, as I said, I decided that I didn't want to use the images, and I was just going to use links. So let's just grab this, just grab it all, and paste it in. And then maybe we can change this to something like popular. All right. And finally, we just need to get this little image that was supposed to be kind of Flickr postings. So, one more. In this one, I am going to, let's do H3, Flickr, photos. And we'll do an image class. I'm going to give it an ID, a class of featured image. Now this will change actually heavily once we move it to WordPress. We'll give it a class of featured image, and that's because I know I'm going to have more than one image within this secondary box div. So I need to be more specific. Let's give it a source. And if you remember, we didn't cut this out, but I called it originally treephoto.jpg. Alt is going to be tree photo. So what I'm going to do now is come back to Photoshop and grab this out, but I don't want you to have to watch that. So I'm going to once again pause. All right, I'm back, and here's the image I cropped out, tree photo. All right, that won't even be used in the final product, but it's more of a placeholder for the time being. So we've successfully linked to that. What next? You can see, if we come back to Photoshop, I gave it just some kind of random generic description that I didn't even use in the final. Ali and I at a restaurant. Ali is my fiance. She is not a tree. That was just generic text. So why don't we change it to something like picture of a tree. All right. And then next, we need the previous next buttons right here. That way the user clicks on them and it slides to a new one. I'm sure you've seen that many times. Let's wrap these in a div with a class of prev_next. Now, we don't necessarily need to give this a class rather than an ID, but just in case we use this somewhere else on the site, let's be safe and use a class. It's going to link nowhere for the time being. And if you remember, we cut out those images. So the alt is going to be more, and the source of this image, let's check it out, is going to be right arrow.png. So img/right arrow.png. Copy that, paste it in, and let's do less, and we're going to change right to left. All right, so let's go to preview, and you see what we got. So we have our header, our main section, and now we have our sidebar, our images, and popular interests. Looks like I made a mistake there. Yep, I'm sure you guys saw that. Let's fix that. Come on down. Did I do it at the bottom too? Shoot. Sorry about this, guys. Okay, so let's continue forward. We're actually almost done. It doesn't take too long once you know what you're doing. Now we need to add this little Twitter bird. So at the end of secondary box, the last one, let's add just an image. So we're going to make it link to our Twitter account, which is twitter.com/nettuts. And within it, the value is actually going to be an image. And the value will be follow us on Twitter. And the source is going to be img/ what did I call it? Twitter-follow.jpg. Nope, PNG. Like so. Okay, come back to edit. Close that image out. So, I wonder if I can make this any smaller. No, it won't let me go any lower. Let's put this on its own line. Trying to keep this as organized as possible for you guys, because you're free to take this template and do whatever you want. If you want to dismantle it and build it up, I'd love to hear from you to see what you guys end up with. So this end secondary and our main div. And you see, if we didn't have these commenting, you just have all these divs. And then you'd have to be thinking to yourself, all right, what is this div closing out? So I really prefer just comment it out, make it as simple as possible. The final thing we might want to do is import jQuery, because I know I'm going to be using it. But you know what? I'm not even going to bother with that for now. So we have preview. This is what we ended up with. The next step is to do the CSS. And you know what? I'm going to separate that into a lesson of its own. That'll be part 4. See you then.